Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you're new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our fourth edition of Wolff Patnaik Dialogue Series. Today, we are discussing socialism. The first three episodes, in many ways, connected to capitalism. The first episode was on tariff. The second episode was on BRICS. And the third episode was on war. Please check them out if you haven't. They have got tens of thousands of views. Um, okay, Professor Wolff, if I could start with you and ask you about your interpretation of Zohran Mamdani. And my specific question to you is, would you interpret the rise of Zohran Mamdani as part of the larger waves of discontent we have seen in the United States, particularly following the global financial crisis, embodied in Occupy Wall Street, Sanders' campaign, labor upsurge, unionization, and so on? Or do you think it's just a local reaction to the Democratic Party's failure to respond to working class voters?
Well, I guess I have to answer by saying it's all of those things. That everything you just said is a very good opening list of where to start thinking about this. I should explain, I am sitting in Manhattan, in the core center of New York City. I voted for Zohran Mamdani myself because it's part of where I live, and he's the candidate of the Democratic Party for the mayor of the city of New York. He won the election to be the Democratic candidate. He still has to stand against others in other parties, not the Democratic Party, in November of this year when the formal election takes place. Normally, in the politics of New York, if you win the Democratic nomination, you win the election because the Democratic Party is by far the dominant political party in this city, and it's been that way for quite a while. Uh, so that's the framework. To respond to your question and to say it in all honesty, we in this country are slowly and hesitantly emerging from 75 years of relentless propaganda and relentless repression of anything and everything having to do with socialism. In my case, I speak personally because that has been my life. But I was born in the United States. I've lived here most of the last 75 years, and that has been my experience without exception. Whether it's the media or the political speech of the leaders or the statements and speech of business community leaders, academics, it doesn't really matter. The forms vary, but the message was very well coordinated. You know, I'm a product of the elite education of this country. I went to Harvard, I went to Stanford, and I went to Yale. That's not the place where you usually produce a socialist, but they produced me. And part of the reason was I was in a constant state of opposition. Every class, every professor was an opportunity for me to learn what was to emerge as my own view about capitalism and socialism. Everyone tried to persuade me and my teachers of the superiority of capitalism and the hopeless dead end, which is how they described socialism. But they did not succeed. And part of that, and now part of my answer, is that they never quite extinguished the movement for socialism. They tried, and they went very far. And for many, many Americans, and this is crucial, that our friends in India and everywhere else understand. For the mass of people, they made socialism into an absurd caricature, a place of dictatorship, a place of no democracy at all, a place of suffering and poverty and misery, uh, unrelenting. And that's true of the New York Times, and it's true of rural newspapers everywhere the same. However, again, there was always resistance, and there were always places you could go. So in my case, I found my way to Harry Magdoff and Paul Sweezy. And those were Americans with whom I could talk and who could teach me, which they did. And they were very self-conscious in teaching me and quite a few others. Even while we were in Harvard, Stanford, Yale, or wherever we went to school, how we could develop a critical consciousness. But we are the exceptions. Everything has changed for us in the last 10, 15 years. Again, I need to underscore that. From having no audience, our audience is now counted in the millions. It's a very heady experience for me because I'm alive to see it and to feel it and to participate. Harry Magdoff isn't. Paul Sweezy isn't. My teacher at Stanford, Paul Baran, isn't. And the others like them. They died, they passed on, but we are here and we are experiencing, and it has to say so, a resurgence of criticism of capitalism and interest, serious interest in socialism as a better alternative. Having said that, I need to add, but it is a feeling, not an understanding. The knowledge of socialism here is, I'll be as polite as I know how, primitive, very primitive. I'm exaggerating, but not by much. I would say over the last 75 years, 90% of what the socialists of the world have been debating and discussing and arguing about and developing is unknown in the United States. They simply don't know. Unless by some fluke they have had to go abroad or become involved in a person from another country who takes them to the literature of that other society, they just don't know. Most Americans only speak English, only read English, and look at the rest of the world as a secondary backdrop to what happens in the great world of the United States, with an occasional look at London or something like that. It's very parochial, and when it comes to socialism, very, very backward. All right, now, with that framework, one last point. In those cases now where socialism is engaged, and I want to be respectful to the millions of Americans who are now willing to think about socialism, who don't simply dismiss it the way we were taught to do for 75 years. They don't. And that's an enormous breakthrough. And if I had to give anyone credit for it, it would be, believe it or not, Bernie Sanders. His willingness not to reject the socialist label in a public way opened a space that has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger ever since. No longer needs him, has momentum of its own. But there's very little understanding of the range of difference among socialists as that has evolved, very little understanding, so that Mr. Mamdani, and by the way, a second person of a socialist who may well become the next mayor of Minneapolis, an important city in the middle of the country, who's also a socialist, and quite a few other socialists in various places getting elected in big elections. Those people are what you would understand as the socialists for whom socialism is mostly about governmental activity and governmental activity displacing or replacing private capitalist activity or regulating capitalism in one way or another. And if you look at the programs, that's what they advocate. They advocate, the government should help people with housing, or the government should help people with, but you can almost write the sentence, the government should help people, and then finish it with 27 different specifics, and that captures what they mean. By the way, this does not mean that these candidates don't, in fact, have greater objectives, more social transformation objectives. They may have them, and that's important, but it cannot be spoken. They will not speak it because their fear is that would immediately take them over the edge back to the silencing that they suffered before. Sorry to take so long, but I wanted to give you some sense of of both the good news and the distance we have to go.
Excellent. I'll come back to some of the things you have touched upon as we discuss, take deeper dive into what socialism is, particularly in 2025. But Professor Patnaik, if you could comment on Professor Wolff, what he just said. And my specific question to you would be, you have been watching the global north, the imperial core from the global south for a very long time. And my specific question would be, how important are these progressive movements in the imperial core, particularly for the global south?
I think Professor Wolff mentioned the last 10, 15 years. I think that's very important. There has been a sea change over that time. To my mind, it's because of the failure of neoliberal capitalism, which is the latest phase of capitalism. It has brought acute distress all over the world to the working people, to workers in the advanced countries, to workers, peasants, petty producers in the third world countries. Now, in this connection, there has also been not only a ripening of the conditions for the emergence of socialist and left movements, but even the actual emergence, you see, because people don't often realize this. The very emergence of Bernie Sanders was the first symptom of it in the United States. Similarly, you look at France, for instance. We look at one implication of the crisis, which is the emergence of fascism and neo-fascism. But at the same time, there is the emergence of a challenge to fascism and neo-fascism, which takes the form not of the liberal bourgeois democratic structures, which really have proven to be quite bankrupt, but of potential socialist left-wing structures. You look at, for instance, France. I mean, Marine Le Pen's party would have swept the polls, except for the fact that you actually had a coalition of the left that even got a majority. So that, similarly, look at Britain, what's happening now. The Labour Party actually expelled Jeremy Corbyn, but Jeremy Corbyn's group now is actually acquiring votes to an extent where the Labour Party itself is likely to be reduced to just 15%, which is about the same that you find in Germany with the Social Democrats. You also find, even in Germany, we all talk about the rise of the AfD, which of course is a fascist outfit, and is getting just over 20% votes. But people don't realize that if you combine the votes of the Linke together with that of Sarah Wagenknecht, which are the two left formations, then that comes to about 14%. In other words, the highest share of votes that the left has got in Germany in the entire post-war period. So the kind of revival of left that is taking place. And in fact, the Linke's votes are now going up even from 9 to 11% and so on. So if you have some kind of a combined left, then you're even likely to have the combined left outstripping the AfD. So there is all over the world, in the context of the crisis, while the ruling classes are reviving fascism and neo-fascism as a prop to their hegemony, you also at the same time have an attempt on the part of the working people to look for alternatives, and socialism has really emerged as an alternative. Of course, as Professor Wolff quite rightly said, that many of the socialist candidates are not necessarily calling themselves socialists. They have an agenda of redistribution. Now, redistributivism is very important, but on the other hand, it's not socialism. But you see, the point is that if you have a consistent commitment to redistribution, in that case, you would necessarily have to open up the way to socialism. For instance, if you have in a country, let's say like India, you have wealth taxation, then the capitalists don't make investments. If the capitalists don't make investments, then you'd have to have public investment taking the place, and so on. And the moment that happens, then the whole center of gravity of the economy shifts away from profit making by a group of individual capitalists towards sort of more kind of, public kind of supervision and control of the society to be run for the benefit of the people. So I think the whole question of socialism, socialist agenda, socialist talk has begun to emerge in the last 10, 15 years, and I think is going to become even stronger in the coming days, because I do not see any solution to this crisis within the existing framework of neoliberal capitalism. What is more, if you look at, for instance, the Hague Convention of the European NATO countries, they're now thinking of devoting 5% of their GDP to defense, to military expenditure. Now, the money, where is the money going to come from? It's going to come by curtailing the welfare state. Such welfare state measures as had been introduced in the post-Second World War period are now going to be rolled back. And that is something which is actually going to make the condition of the working people even worse, and therefore make socialism as an alternative that much more powerful and attractive.
If I could comment, it's very important, that last point that Professor Patnaik made. I'd like to build on it, because in that remark, he grasps what I think is the core remarkable phenomena here in the United States, which is exactly the feeling. I wish I remembered his exact words, but the feeling that his words conveyed, that the system doesn't work. Masses of Americans are now able to say that. They are able to take the step beyond, I can't get quite the job I want, or I haven't got quite the income I need, or I can't afford to get married, or I can't afford to have children, or fill in the blank. There's a whole, and those feelings, which are, by the way, quite realistic, have come together to give them something which I thought would take much longer, which is, and I say this with all the hesitancy, of someone who had to be persuaded of what I'm about to say. There is now an awareness that I had never seen in the United States in my life, that the problem is systemic. It isn't this or that. It is a whole, and not only is it systemic, but the acceptable word is capitalism. You can say it's a systemic problem and it's capitalism. Capitalism has now become part of the humor of the American people. We are making jokes. Our leading comedians, who have never shown any political awareness at all, are now finding it convenient to make a joke where the butt of the joke, the point of the joke, is a capitalist who's doing something bad, or a capitalist who's very stupid, or a capitalist who makes one mistake after another. In other words, it's the humor which gives you a feeling that the level of alienation is enormous from this system. It is not cultivating loyalty to itself. On the contrary, if I had to say what enabled Mr. Mamdani to be as successful as he is, and I should mention, I do not know him. I have no personal relationship with him. I admire the work of his father, who is a professor at Columbia University here, and who wrote what I consider to be the best book on the colonization and colonial economy of East Africa that exists. He is the son, therefore, of something very interesting that goes way beyond what he says in public. You know, fathers and sons are different, so who knows? But I will tell you that his vote is a vote that he was able to get, and no disrespect to him at all, because he was able to present himself as the embodiment of every younger person's alienation and a good deal of older person's alienation too. He is fresh, new, young, coming to maybe give us a change. And people are so alienated from the Republican and Democratic parties alike that he's in this remarkable situation where he actually may win despite the hostility of the banks and the big businesses and all the usual enemies of this way of thinking.
I wanted to ask Professor Patnaik and Professor, or both of you, but maybe Professor Patnaik could start. But by picking up what Professor Patnaik said in during the course of his comments, you said that once you start combating inequality, you eventually open up the path for socialism. And I wanted to spend some time on this idea of what would in the past might have been considered struggles for social democracy, little bit of universal public services, progressive taxation, some stronger labor laws, but that's about it. That's embedded in a larger capitalist structure, as opposed to struggle for power and class struggle, which was traditionally understood as socialism. And so my question to you is, are we living in a moment where progressive taxation, whether wealth tax or a high income tax and corporate tax, coupled with some sort of universal public services, whether that itself is considered as socialism, or are we still talking about power and class struggle?
No, I mean, obviously, we are talking about power and class struggle, but I would like to underline the dialectics of it. You see, for instance, let us say in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution occurred on the slogan of land, peace, and bread. Now, if it is the case that the Kerensky government had actually assured land, peace, and bread, then there was no Bolshevik revolution. In other words, there is a dialectics between the immediate issues and, of course, the ultimate structures. The point is that the ultimate structures determine, in a sense, the degree to which you can respond to the demands for immediate issues. And that is exactly the dialectics between redistributivism and socialism that I was really talking about. That, that in the post-war years, in Western Europe, labor was given an immense amounts of concession. Workers were not going to go back to the 1930s, where you had this massive unemployment and so on, a Great Depression and so on. So the point is that they elected social democratic governments, and because the social democratic governments brought about a certain amount of welfare state measures, the need for transcending the system was actually negated. Okay. But the point is that as the system consolidates itself, and now you have the hegemony of international capital, international finance capital that does not want, if you have more welfare state measures in one country, but in the third world you don't have, then you go and locate your investment there. Therefore, now what you have is capital is global, but on the other hand, working class struggles, working class victories also are basically essentially had been achieved within nation states, within national boundaries. And therefore, there is an attempt to roll back these victories, which becomes easy because capital is now globalized. And when this rolling back then, which gives rise to the immediate distress of the workers, is then compounded system where you have stagnation, where you do not have employment at all increasing and so on. So you then have really a fairly unsustainable, unbearable condition for the working people. And precisely the conditions that had held back the march of socialism in the advanced capitalist world, particularly I'm talking Western Europe in the post-war period, are now being undone. And therefore, the historical condition, I'm not saying tomorrow there's going to be socialism, but the historical conditions are really opening up for an onward movement of socialism.
Again, I'm struck by the parallels in the way Professor Patnaik is looking at this and the way that I do too. And I feel validated a little bit by hearing this. Let me pick up on this thought. Here in the United States, we may actually have a dialectic in Hegel's original sense of it, working in the other way. There is in the United States a pretty clear understanding that the period after World War II can be described, as I describe it all the time publicly, but I can do that because it's accepted, that the period after World War II can be described as the undoing of the New Deal. The New Deal was the name given in the 30s by the Roosevelt administration to its very social democratic program. Just to remind everyone, the Great Depression of the 1929 saw the American working class sharply move to the left. It gave rise to a powerful communist party, two socialist parties, and the greatest labor union organizing drive in American history that brought millions for the first time into organized labor unions. And it all got capped off in World War II with the United States allied with the Soviet Union. But it was for the ruling class a shock that they never recovered from because they were made to pay for it. Taxes were raised on them very sharply, and what the government didn't get in taxes, it took in forced loans. So the government took it all and gave Social Security and unemployment compensation and 15 million public service jobs, things we have never had again. Unbelievable. The whole 20th century is really the collapse. That's the first third. And then and here comes Professor Patnaik's remark, rollback, the post-World War II taking it all away, which literally culminates in Trump, who is simply the last or the most recent and perhaps in some way most extreme, both in what it does and in the verbiage with which it does it. But that creates dialectically the following argument that I and people like me can make in the United States, and which it is my hope the Mamdanis being elected that they will make this the following argument. In the 1930s, there was a great debate between the socialists and the communists, reform or revolution, in the old sense of Rosa Luxemburg and all the others. And that struggle was won by the reformists, and the revolutionaries were defeated. And they even, with a few exceptions, went along with the following deal. We will support Mr. Roosevelt for president, but he has to be a social democrat. He has to pass Social Security, unemployment compensation, a minimum wage for the first time, incredible program, which he did. That deal was made. And the reformist won. And then I look across the audience and I say to a group of Americans who are nodding because they understand it, I said, then, because you didn't make a revolution, you left in the hands of the capitalists the profits, and now with your social democracy, the incentive to use the profits to roll back the impingement on their profitability, which is what they did, starting in 1946 and without stopping the whole way, right up until Mr. Trump. And then I pull the punch. I say, so now we have history teaching us that we shouldn't be debating reform versus revolution. The trick is to understand that you focus on reforms while teaching that the only way to secure a reform is to make the revolution. And that argument, which was so difficult 50 years ago, is now occurring to people in the street. And that's the magic of this moment, which we are all hoping stays here and matures and develops.
I want to pin down a little bit on this question of reform and revolution. I mean, I am I'm convinced to some extent that this sharp distinction between reform and revolution might be a little bit outdated, and we should be talking about any incremental step as reform while still talking about revolution. Nevertheless, I just want to be a little bit more clear, because in a traditional setting, revolution was understood as starting with the breakdown of the state and then a total reconstruction of the state, where the communist parties often took lead and the whole society was reconstructed. There are many components, but nationalization of major means of production, collectivization of land, and so on and so forth were very central to it. And quite often, anti-imperial struggles were very central to it. But we are not in those circumstance in a lot of cases. I mean, in some cases we are, perhaps. There are very important transformations happening in Sahel region, for instance, where imperialism is very dominant. But I'm thinking about the farmer struggles in India, or I'm thinking about the coming of the JVP to power in Sri Lanka, or Mamdani in the United States. These struggles are still fought from within the structures of bourgeois politics. To that extent, what does revolution mean when we are talking about minimum wage or some progressive taxation, while still having to rely on private capital and their mercy?
If I can just come in here, to my mind, revolution is nothing else but a consistent commitment, the outcome of a consistent commitment to basic reform. In other words, I think this distinction between reform and revolution is something which I don't accept, because the two are dialectically related. And typically, you look at Syriza, for instance. Syriza came to power promising reform. But on the other hand, Syriza could not promise reform because of the fact that it continued to remain trapped within the whole network of global capital flows and global financial flows. So the point is that if Syriza had remained committed to its agenda of reforms, it would have had to get out of that framework. And the moment you get out of that framework, then you start making changes which are of a fundamental nature in the entire capitalist arrangement within which you're trapped. So then your move reforms are nothing else but the ultimate outcome of remaining loyal to, revolution is nothing else but the ultimate outcome of remaining loyal to your agenda of reforms. Those who shy away from this are people who basically compromise on reforms themselves. And Syriza is a good example. And I fear in many of the cases you have said, Sri Lanka is a very good example. Well, Chile may in fact be electing fairly soon. There's a great possibility of a communist president in Chile. Now, in all these cases, the thing to notice is, are they moving ahead with their agenda of reforms? Or is it the case that they're backtracking on the agenda? If you move away with the agenda of reform, then you would have to change the structures within which you live. And that change is what I call a revolution.
I can illustrate this. Mr. Mamdani is going here in New York. If he gets elected, has promised, for example, to make public transportation free, so that the people of the city of New York can use the subway trains, the buses, and so on, and it will be free, right? He's also said he's going to take major action to lower rents. The cost of housing here is unspeakable. I mean, it's beyond anything. All right, now, if he moves in that direction, the landlords, who are the people who run the city, and the big banks are going to push back against him. And then will come the moment that Professor Patnaik has just mentioned. Either he will raise the question, how is it possible that something everybody in New York wants can be held back by a tiny minority of people by virtue of the fact that they control the money? Now, one answer is we give up. That's what the liberals will suggest. They're already suggesting it. But the other one, if Mr. Mamdani is committed in exactly the way Professor Patnaik has just outlined, then, not out of some abstract notion of reform and revolution, but out of a very practical moment, he will have to raise the question, which for us is, of course, the systemic question. How could so small a minority have such control over the whole social wealth? That is the problem. Not the particular of how they're using it, but that they're in a position to do that. And to change that is what moves reform into revolution.
I want to ask my next question about private capital a little bit. And I want to understand from both of you what your thoughts are on private capital insofar as socialism is concerned. First of all, there used to be socialists, Marxists, and others in the past used to say that total abolition of private capital. If you could explain whether that meant actual total abolition of private capital, or did it mean like mainly nationalization of major means of production, that would be useful, because I do think, and let me know whether you agree or not, I do think that history has shown us that the private sector does have a role to play. And if I'm correct, then the question is, what kind of role does the private sector have? So China does offer some set of answers to us, things like banking, things like public infrastructure, education, et cetera, and including productive means of production, including industries and so on, are in the large part of that is nationalized. And then you have the whole range of private sector, including land, but small businesses and so on. Is that the model, or are we looking for something more than that in the hands of the public sector? How do you look at the role of the private sector when we think of socialism for the future?
Even here, there is a dialectics which one has to appreciate. After independence in India, in a whole range of newly decolonized countries, there was the agenda of socialism. In India, for instance, Pandit Nehru kept talking about a socialistic pattern of society. Elsewhere also, you had kind of, Nyerere, you had many other third world leaders talking about socialism. The basic presumption there was that you can actually have both private and public enterprise, but that the state could control the private enterprise. Okay. Now, I think capitalism has a kind of dynamic. It has a spontaneity in the sense that, this kind of a situation is one in which one side or the other tends to become stronger over time. For instance, kind of I can give you the example of India. You had over time a strengthening of the private sector, which of course, in combination with the fact that all over the world there was a consolidation of capitalism, particularly neoliberal capitalism, globalization of capital, it tilted the balance against the public sector. So you can have public and private capital, but to see it as an equilibrium situation where you can permanently freeze the economy in that kind of a kind of ratio, if you like, between public and private, is something which I do not believe is correct. Because as I said, in capitalism, the world as a whole is, of course, capitalist. Wherever you would have socialism, it would be in some particular country. Therefore, you are having a certain dynamics of capitalism, and therefore you are continuously disrupting the existing proportions, even inside the country, between the public and the private sector, the weights of the two. And therefore, it follows that unless you are prepared for that, unless you mobilize the working people against that kind of a possibility, you would actually have to give up your socialist project and move towards capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, and so on, as has happened in every third world country that decolonized. So I think there is a dialectics there. I'm not saying for a moment that tomorrow, if a government committed to fundamental change comes to power, it should nationalize everything. No, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that it should be aware of the fact that while private capital continues, there is a continuous attempt at subversion arising from the dynamics of capitalism itself, of whatever control the state or the public sector has acquired over the commanding heights of the economy.
My response would be similar. I would say this, that in many ways, the Chinese model, what they call socialism with Chinese characteristics, is a combination of state and private capitalism that has demonstrated that it can grow faster over a longer period of time than any private capitalism can do. This reality is now shaking to its core the United States as a society. It has to come to terms with the reality I just articulated, and it cannot do so. It can't admit it. It can't face it. It can't do anything other than try to slow it, repress it, stop it, deprive it, attack it, whatever. And the only disagreement is how best to do that, not whether to do that, at least for the moment. That's the effort to undertake it. And it seems to me that there's a lesson there. And I think the lesson will be learned here in the United States, perhaps not in my lifetime, but it's coming. And it's the old lesson. If you can't beat them, join them. That what we will see in the United States and Western Europe is a copying of what has happened in China, differently organized, but it will be an attempt, if I can paraphrase what Professor Patnaik said, it will be an attempt to get the advantages of a mixed system, but with the private more dominant over the state than the other way around, for all the obvious reasons that would be at least the ideal of a progressive capitalist politician who offers that as a way out of the dead end that they're now in. And in order to make that happen, or to maybe put it differently, in order to plan on how to answer that question, which socialists will have to respond to if I'm right about where it's going, then socialists have to have something to say about the last point Professor Patnaik made, where he said almost at the end of his sentence, with the state sector somehow dominant. Is that where we're going? Is it that socialism will be the mixture with the state part dominant, and what we used to call capitalism will be a mixture with the private part dominant? Is that the juxtaposition that we're looking at? Or, which I would prefer, to go the next step and to say, no, we really do mean a transformation of the workplace to put the working people in charge. Right there, not just at the high levels of government and politics and parliament, but in each workplace, it becomes a democratic community of the people at the workplace who decide collectively and democratically what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the product. That, for me, then becomes a clear revolutionary step beyond any and all combinations of state and private.
Yes, I completely agree with that. As a matter of fact, to me, socialism is not just a question of having a higher growth rate or a question of greater production and so on and so forth. Socialism, to me, is about freedom. And I think it's a freedom that is achieved by the recreation of a community which capitalism destroys. The community that existed, that capitalism destroyed, was, of course, an exploitative community. You had landlords, you had feudal lords, and so on. But the whole building up towards socialism takes place when you have the formation of a new community. Individual workers come together to form unions. And that union is in a sense, the embryo of a new community. So to me, individual freedom can really be enjoyed only when the individual is part of a community, and the creation of that community is fundamentally the characteristic of socialism. And that is something which goes much beyond simply how much private and public capital to have, what growth rate to have, and so on and so forth. So fundamentally, but I think again, it's related, because obviously if you have an economy with substantial private capital, you're not creating any community, because you have to create conditions for private capital to operate, and those conditions are essentially against the interests of the workers. So the movement towards socialism must take the form of the creation of a community within which then individuals can really enjoy their freedom. This whole idea of capitalism giving you individual freedom is something which I reject, because as a matter of fact, the individual freedom that you have under capitalism is one in which you're nonetheless coerced to act in particular ways. You have to act in particular ways in the factory, otherwise you get thrown out and join the reserve army of labor, and then so on. So that effectively it's a system that coerces individuals to act in particular ways in order to maintain its kind of spontaneity. But socialism breaks that spontaneity, and that gets broken only when individuals come together to form a community and collectively intervene in shaping their own destiny.
Yes, that I agree. I agree. That is, and I really do think that's a very, very important issue right now, as there is a growing interest in socialism. We have the obligation to make it clear we respect other definitions of socialism, but we have a different one. And we have to live with that. There's a tension there. I understand that. But I think we can support the reformer with our revolutionary perspective on how to do that and what's at stake. And they don't have to agree, but we have to have the right to say that there are these multiple concepts of socialism, and that that's not a bad thing, and that's a sign of the health of a tradition.
Yeah, I guess my follow-up would be to seek a little bit more clarity about the tension itself. I think what um, what we are talking about have basically two components. One is the sort of labor capital relationship, how much freedom people have at workplace, how much the working class is empowered politically, kind of having a permanent job, benefits, schools, neighborhood facilities, and so on and so forth. That's one component which I think is absolutely non-negotiable under socialism, because if you give away that component, the working class politics itself and power is gone, and you live a life of precarity. Even if you have a good salary for some part of your life, there is always some precarity. But then I think the other element is also about the aggregate growth, isn't it? Because there is the question of, even if you have full employment, but if you don't produce a dynamic economy where productivity can constantly be increased, then over a period of time, you do fall behind others, where maybe they were capitalists and they had more precarity and they maybe didn't even reach full employment, but they were more dynamic in that sense. And so they have better material standard of living. Maybe that's not equally distributed, but overall you see some of that. So my question is, and I'm thinking about China here, because much of China's success came through very high growth that was produced by dynamism of market, and not necessarily by redistribution or empowerment of its laboring class. I wonder, Professor Patnaik, what your thoughts on what I just tried to think about.
No, I greatly admire what has been achieved in China. But at the same time, I have very strong and serious reservations also about what has been achieved in China. I mean, my notion of a socialist society, for instance, is not a one-party dictatorship. My notion of a socialist society is not one in which, let's say, there's unemployment. It is not one in which there is poverty. And even though China has overcome its unemployment and poverty to a substantial extent, I believe these things still remain. Okay, so the point is that therefore, my notion of socialism goes beyond simply the idea of technological achievements and growth dynamism. Yes, you're right that after all you have to have these things, but on the other hand, to my mind, they're secondary to the idea of freedom, the idea of the freedom of the working people in a collective sense to intervene and shape their own lives, economic as well as political, and so on and so forth. So I think that is very important to me. So I would not think of China as a model socialist country, not at all. I mean, I really think they have a long way to go before they can actually talk in terms of being socialist.
Professor Wolff.
Yes, I don't want to be in. I understand what Professor Patnaik has said, and I think I agree. But I need to be, partly because I'm here in the United States, I suspect. I need to be a bit more positive about the Chinese achievement. It is so much better than what we have here in what they are doing that are they the model? No, no, I agree. They're not. But they are a success story for the global South that will have ramifications for decades to come as Asia, Africa, Latin America look for models, for steps, for ways out of the debilitating poverty and subordination that they suffer. And watching China not only achieve the growth rates, but as we're seeing now, flexing its ideological and political muscles also, this is very, very profound. And if, for example, to play with the dialectic for a moment, if China could be a model for efforts at reform here in the United States, when the achievement of the Chinese to lift, if I understand the UN report, 800 million people out of poverty, or at least out of extreme poverty, and we have growing poverty here in the United States. And if we can push for reforms along the lines of what they've already done, and if those could be informed by a revolutionary perspective, well, then we might be able to do more with what the Chinese have achieved than they could. And that shouldn't surprise one, because the Chinese took things from the United States and did more with them than the United States could. I mean, and that is, in a way, as it should be.
Professor Patnaik, you wanted to add something?
I mean, when I'm saying that, that I'm not thinking of China as a model, I'm sure this is something which the Chinese communists themselves would agree with. In fact, there was a time, for instance, that for the sake of industrialization, there used to be clashes between the militia and the peasantry, because peasants' land had to be taken away. And because of which, the party leadership itself at one point came out with a program called Towards a Socialist Countryside, in which it actually made a whole range of changes. So China is, as it were, it's a process. It's a process. But I think in this process, we have to evaluate the direction of movement in terms of the degree to which people feel free and the degree to which a sense of community is created. That's what I was saying. I mean, but we must not think of China as the end. the end of the road. Rather, it is in a position. I agree with with Professor Wolff that it has great achievements to its credit, and certainly compared to the United States or India that we have today, which is utterly horrible, it really is a beacon of hope. But at the same time, we have to be clear that it is a process. It's work in progress. And in this work in progress, we have to continuously look beyond what has been achieved, and from the perspective of, as I said, those criteria in terms of the degree to which human freedom is being advanced, the degree to which sense of community is being advanced, and so on.
I would only add, if I could, somewhere Marx writes that no system disappears until it has tried every conceivable form in which to survive. And in my reading, socialism and capitalism do not have a boundary that is clear and fixed and firm. It is very fuzzy. And what the final stages are of a capitalism trying desperately to hold on in one form or another, and where socialism begins, I think those things overlap, and that it is productive to keep that in mind when looking at the United States flailing around in its desperation. And this morning's headlines, just to give you an idea of how crazy it is. In this morning's headline, President Trump has accused former President Obama of treason, which is a crime punishable by death under American law. I mean, and that's just a sign of how bad the breakdowns of society here are. But I think that our difficulty in looking at China and weighing the positive, the worrisome, and all of that, that's the boundary that's fuzzy. And we should appreciate that it's that boundary, because it gives you a way of understanding what the direction of change likely is.
I'm very aware we have hit the 1 hour mark, but can I just throw in one last question if we could spend 5 more minutes in that? Okay. I wanted to discuss finally a little bit on the political structure. And Professor Patnaik said that I would not like socialism to be a one-party dictatorship. And I wanted to pick up on that and maybe also throw in the question of decentralization, centralization, because to my mind, in a complex society, a lot of the social and economic functions have to be highly centralized. I'm thinking about banking, I'm thinking about finance, I'm thinking about even education, I'm thinking about ecological challenges, etc., etc. I cannot conceive of a society which is not centralized to a great extent. And I think real examples of socialisms have generally been centralized, even though that doesn't mean that you don't have decentralization within it. So my question to you, Professor Patnaik, and I think Professor Wolff can then wrap it up. Why not a one-party state? After all, if we need these long-term developments which need to rely on centralization, and as long as it represents a class struggle, why do you want to see these circus every 5 years? I'm assuming if it's not one party, what is the political structure that you have in mind when you're thinking about socialism?
No, I let me remind you, I was talking about a one-party dictatorship. There is a history of socialist theory in which, when Marx had talked about dictatorship of the proletariat, then in the 1930s there was a theorization that every class gets represented by one party. Stalin theorized it, and therefore the dictatorship of the proletariat became dictatorship of the Communist Party on the grounds that the Communist Party represented represents a proletariat. Now, I think that is something which actually led to a depoliticization of the working class. Because imagine if the Soviet Union collapsed, there was not even a general strike by the workers to defend the Soviet Union. Now, that's amazing. A revolutionary order collapses, and the class in whose name that order was created doesn't even go on a general strike, which is quite amazing. That's because it had led to a depoliticization of the working class. Now, I think, of course, I agree with you about centralization, decentralization. I would like to put it the other way. You said that if you have a centralized society or economy or order, then you would have to have a one-party state. I would put it the other way around, namely that, that I would be opposed to a one-party dictatorship and opposed to centralization to the extent that it depoliticizes the working class. It depoliticizes. I mean, politics is the way we live, and therefore, I think the idea of people getting depoliticized is what oppresses me. I mean, in other words, I don't like the idea of people getting depoliticized, partly because, I mean, I myself, even though we have had no revolution in India, we had an anti-colonial struggle, and I've seen people being political. I mean, okay, I was born after the struggle was over, but my memories of it, my father, in fact, was involved in the anti-colonial struggle, spending years in jail, and so the point is, people as the subjects of history, people as kind of agents who are not depoliticized, who are active. That is what I would like.
But does centralization necessarily depoliticize? Or I would in fact argue that if the communist parties in the Soviet Union didn't assume some of the powers from the Soviets, the Soviet Union itself would have collapsed. So on one hand, one can argue that it was unfair for the Communist Party to centralize some of its power and take away from the Soviets. But on the other hand, if the military, if the whole planning between different organs of industry and so on were not centralized and created, the maybe the union itself would have collapsed.
No, I'd like to distinguish here between two things. You may say that about China today, you may say that about the Soviet Union, that centralization and having a command economy gave the Soviet Union the wherewithal, the capacity to withstand capitalist encirclement, to withstand capitalist aggression. Okay. Now, I think the necessity to withstand capitalist aggression and the structures required for it cannot, however, define our ideal of socialism. Okay, because so that's what I'm trying to say. Yes, all these may be necessary. The point is that that in order to prevent, let us say, a coup d'etat engineered by imperialism in your country, you yourself have to have a very kind of rigorous system of counter-espionage and this and that, which can have authoritarian implications. But on the other hand, that's not my ideal of socialism. That is something which are necessitated by the problems of transition.
Professor Wolff, wrap it up for us.
Okay. In my understanding of Marxism's complex studies of the state, I like the old idea, which I think goes back at least to Lenin, that the state is the executive committee of the ruling class. And for me, therefore, it follows that all the states, forms of state that have emerged out of the collapse of feudalism and the last 5 centuries of capitalism spreading to cover the globe the way it does now, that what we have seen is the complicated development over time, the evolutionary development of a state apparatus appropriate, as much as they could do it, to the needs of capitalism. if we are able to build the community Professor Patnaik talks about, workers at the workplace becoming their own employer, so that the class difference between master, slave, lord, serf, employer, employee is finally over, that kind of a reorganization at the base will have to work out for itself the state forms, central, decentralized, and so on, that reproduce that system, just the way capitalism has made use of parliament, dictator, as it needed it for its own survival and its own development. But we should not be held back in our thinking and planning and imagination as if we had to pick among the forms of capitalism the kind of central or decentralized state apparatus that we are going to have in a socialist system. And there I would end only with a quotation from a man from whom I learned a great deal. Louis Althusser, the French communist philosopher, had an idea about ideological state apparatuses. And he didn't develop this part of the idea, although he spoke to some of us. I spent some time with him. He spoke to us about it. And one of the things he said was to understand that out of a different class structure comes a wholly different role for ideology. So it isn't anymore a state apparatus. That was a very liberatory idea for all of us. And it's really that I'm working on a little bit as I respond to your question.
This was extremely helpful, particularly your comment about the parallels with capitalism. If capitalism, the supposedly most decentralized, so decentralized that it's individual atoms and nothing else, if that can figure out how to centralize itself, including organs like parliaments, Congress, the Federal Reserve, and so on and so forth, then why should socialism organized from below not be able to figure out to what extent they would centralize? This was very helpful, Professor Wolff and Professor Patnaik. I didn't want this discussion to be softball discussions among socialists, taking up very easy questions about how grand and how great the ideals are, but I wanted to figure out what the real contradictions within socialism or societies moving towards socialism would be, and your answers were really profound and helpful. Thank you so much, both of you, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank
I'm
you.
learning. I'm learning from this, so I'm very happy to do this.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.